I brought this jacket all the way from Pittsburgh, so I'm going to wear it. All right. We're going to walk through this. If you guys would just hold your questions to the end, that'd be good. That way we can kind of have an off-camera kind of discussion with all of the different questions. But I can answer as many as Dr. Candy gives me time to cover. So the focus is really, we're going to be talking about the funding projector. Some of you dread doing it. Some of you, some of you have challenges going through it. It's like, oh yeah, I got to do that again, and it's something we do on an annual basis. But this is just an overview and review to be able to help you with what is it, what are all of the different bells and whistles to it, why is it important, and how it can help you in your church planting. So we can go to, who's got slides for me? Yeah, I'll just, next slide. So the first thing is this, obviously, this cover the financial side of church planting. Obviously, as you guys are in the middle of it, you know there is a financial component to it as well. But really, I want you guys to understand, if you walk away with nothing else, know that the funding projector is for you. It's not, yes, it's required by NAM, but we want you guys to do the exercise so that you're thinking of the financial side of it all. Yeah, yes, there's a spiritual side, a physical side, but the financial piece is critical as well. It's the how you're going to be able to afford and do all of what God is calling you to do. What does that look like financially? So, but it's really for you. It's for you to think through, because here's the thought process, is that you're here and you say, we're planting a church. But I've come across some guys at times who are really starting a ministry. And that's a difference. Because a church, when you become in Southern Baptist life, a church, you are an autonomous church. That means that, the church ideally should be able to live off of tithe and offering. And whatever that is raised through tithe and offering is what then is spent out in a budget, and those two should balance. So if your church and your annual budget is $150,000 a year, that means you're raising $150,000 through tithe and offering, and therefore your expenses then roughly match. So that's kind of the thought process. So in order to do that and to get there, you have to think through where do we start? And what's the process of us getting there to get to that level of what we call financial autonomy? And so that's the thought process of the financial side of church planting. Sometimes you're in a context in church planting where the neighborhood you're in, the socioeconomics of the community or the people that you're reaching, you will start to understand real quickly that the tithe and offering will not be able to equal the expenses. That you're going to have tithe and offering that's $30,000 and you're going to have expenses of $100,000. And so the thought process there is that if you know you're going to have a significant gap on an annual basis, then you're going to have outside support. And that's what that's my definition of a ministry, is something that people are going to have to continually give to externally in order for you to be able to meet. Now, the other thought process is that then I'm going to be a bivocational church planner, which means that I'm always going to go and I'm going to earn $50,000 outside of normal tithe and offering, and that's going to help balance out those expenses that I have. So if the church expenses income's 30, I'm probably going to have to go out and work for $50,000 or find some way to fill that gap vocationally. Now that gets me to 80, and now I only have to cut back the church expenses to, let's say, $80,000 down from 100. Now we have a balanced budget. So there are ways to do it. Obviously you can make numbers sing, but the goal is to how can you get to that point where you're going to have a balanced budget in a church. And most of you guys, I know if you had your druthers, you would be a full-time pastor. You would not have to work outside the church. And so, but there are things you have to work through with regards to that. So that's kind of the thought process. It's also for your partners. Because once you finish putting together your funding projector, it gets sent to all of your major partners. You don't have to give it to individual givers necessarily, but you're going to give it to your main partners, your sending church, your supporting church, and yes, you should have them both. And we can talk about offline what those look like. But a sending church could be a major church, and it's going to be probably your strongest financial giving church that's behind you. As a sending church, they're there for financial, moral, physical support. So it's for your partners as well, because it allows them to be able to see how you're progressing or not progressing towards the goal of being financially autonomous. All right, so we'll move on to the next slide. This particular planter I'm working with loves Denzel Washington, so you'll just see this throughout the whole process. But this is page one of your, page one, if you guys are all familiar with this, of the front page of your funding projector. The thought process is to take you guys through it step by step by step. That looks good for me. That's kind of the way I had it. I was just trying to blow up the numbers so you guys can see it. But this is page one. So as we go through it here, you're going to see that obviously you're going to put in, some guys, don't get too fancy with your projection name. You can just usually put the year on it, 2019, 2020, whatever it is. That's going to be your projection name. Your church name is going to be unique. Some of you guys run into problems with that, and you have to change the name of the church multiple times, but they fixed that part. Obviously, church plan in city, Philadelphia, and then choose a reviewer. Whoever your CPC is that's what goes there. So under reviewer, your CPC is where that goes. And convention name is Baptist Convention of Pennsylvania, South Jersey, otherwise known as the BRN. That is the Baptist Resource Network, and that's the state convention that you guys are planting in. We'll move on to the next slide. Here we're going to deal with your church attendance. And it's pretty straightforward. Pay no attention to the boxes that are grayed out. Those numbers are not going to matter for the sake of this discussion. But the thought process is beginning church attendance. And we started at 30. That's probably the minimum number of people that you want to have to be able to go through a funding projector to start to get what we would call, say, significant funding. There have been guys who are starting a church plant. They come to us and they put beginning attendance 10 people, 12 people. And I'll say it this way. There are times where I'll say is that most of the, if you are being discipled and you're discipling somebody else, usually that person you're discipling, if you see leadership potential in them, you're calling them and asking them to start a small group or to run a small group. Well, in most cases, when some people are working a small group from their house, they're having anywhere from 8 to 12 people in that small group. And so a lot of times I've had planters who had a smaller amount, and I said, well, that's really a small group yet. That's not necessarily what you're going to be able to launch out with as a church plant. Now, everything's situation is going to vary, but I've always asked guys, I say, well, how much are you paying the guy to be able to do the small group of 8 to 12? Oh, I'm not paying him anything. I said, but yet still, you guys are asking us to give you $1,000 a month for 12 people in the basement. So just think through it logically. You almost have to think of it as, because as we go further along, you have, as a church planter, you have the freedom to kind of name your own quote-unquote salary. But you have to also think through is that as your church becomes autonomous, well, the church is going to ultimately vote on your salary as a pastor in most cases. And so the thought is what is that church going to see as reasonable for you to be able to minister unto them? What are they going to see as a number that they feel they can live with as a church? Because you have a lot of different church polity as it varies by church, but ultimately that's what it's going to get to. So in reality, what we as a partner of yours, and understand North American Mission Board, whom I represent, as well as the Baptist Resource Network, we are partners of yours. I hate the word boss, as some of you already know. But it's there are areas where we lead, there are areas where we support, but we're really a partner, and we come alongside you. And I always say to planters, we're having this conversation. You guys are in front of me because you said God said. And you have to always start there. And a lot of times you start looking at your partners as God or your sending church as God. And he's the one, he said, I will provide all and supply all of your needs. And that's what we always have to remember. It may not always come from your sending church or from NAM or BRN. It may come from you working, or it may come from some other ways in which God calls you to be able to do the ministry that he's called you to. So just trying to explain and give you guys some background for what that looks like. So getting back to the attendance piece, starting with 30 people, that's, day one, we're starting we're having a church. That's our what you would call launch time, and it can be pre-launch as well. Just so you know, if you say, well, we got 30 people, but we're not going to launch until into year one. Because some people say, I want to get to 45 or 60 before we have our launch. And I truly hate the word launch, but that's just me. When you start having public services, it's probably the best way to say it. So then after your projected weekly attendance, that's average attendance, members, non-members, include children as well. That's your number of 45. And the reason why you include children is because it'll work in the math on the other side as well once we get there. You'll see how we're doing it on the next slide. And then each year you give a projection as to the attendance that you believe. And this should be just a thought process as of how you've prayed over it. Ultimately, I would say if God's called you to plant, ask the question. He's obviously given you as the pastor, as a church planter, the vision for what the plant is ultimately going to look like. And I won't go into it too much here today, but the thought process is that understand to keep the vision as pure as you possibly can. Whatever vision God gave you to plant the church, write it down. One of the biggest mistakes I made when I planted the church was that I took the vision that God gave and I added my interpretation of it, which then became the goal I shot for. And then when God fulfilled the vision that he gave me, I missed it because I was still looking for the vision plus my interpretation of it to what it was going to look like. And God had gotten to the vision, and it took me a while to really understand that. So the vision that he gives you, we'll try to get a really good sense of what's that going to ultimately look like, because that's what you're going to be shooting for. He may not be calling you to be a church of 100. He may be asking you to be a church of 300. He may be asking you to be a church of 50. So that's where you have to think of, what am I ultimately shooting for? I mean, obviously, we as men, we want to impact as many people as possible, right? But God has already ordained, when he called you, who he wants you to reach and what that's going to ultimately look like. So try to get a good sense of what that ultimate final number is going to look like and then project to there. And it's going to change from year to year. One thing I want you to notice in between years 2 and 3, you'll notice that I kept the number at 60. It doesn't change, projected attendance, because every church plant has a back door. Everybody that enters into the church plant and joins does not stay. Somebody say amen. They don't all stay. And you have to allow for a year where you may have 20 new people show up, but you have 20 people leave for just various reasons. Life happens to people. So the thought process, and I don't think I've ever seen, all of the church planter projectors I see always are the straight line, right? It's like, you're a great adventure and it's going up. It's always going up, right? We won't talk about the downside. But the thought process is, feel free to add in a year of, that year between 2 and 3 could just simply be the church plant catching their breath. Like a hurricane that's kind of stalled over a little bit cooler waters that hasn't really gotten to full strength yet. It kind of is reorganizing and getting to the point where, you kind of plateau a little bit, but then, the expectation is to get to that 100. It doesn't have to be in a straight line. Next slide. And if you guys have questions, like I said, kind of jot them down or make a mental note, and we can come back and cover whatever you need. This is offering, and this is usually probably the screen that confuses everybody the most. I want you to think of total attendance, adults, children, members, non-members. And the number that we're saying is per person per week. The best example I could give is if you have a family, husband and wife and 2 kids, the perfect American family, so to speak. 4 people, if they give $100 a week, you just simply divide that by 4 and it's $25 per week. Because there are 4 of them, $25. So that family would be giving $25 per week. We found that the range for planting in Pennsylvania, South Jersey is somewhere between $5 to $25 as the average. I'll leave out names of neighborhoods, but if you're in a poorer neighborhood, your average is going to be a whole lot lower per week. If you're in a more affluent area, it's going to be a lot higher. Also, typically what you're going to have is that typically you're going to probably start out with a higher average than what you're going to wind up at the end. Because generally speaking, year one, you're most likely launching with mostly existing believers. Your core team has mostly got people who are already in the faith. They already understand what a tithe is. You don't have to explain it to them. And hopefully all of your core team members are tithing.
Amen.
Amen.
I mean, that's critical. That's critical. If somebody's that I see if somebody's not tithing, they're in disobedience. And do you really want to go into battle with somebody who's being disobedient? Best to be like Gideon and get to the point where you get those that get that start with that smaller number, but get men and women who are tithers to be a part of your core team. So, but if that's true, then that number is going to be higher. Because guess what? As you start to reach people in the community, you're going to start reaching people who are coming to church, who are interested in the gospel, who are interested or you're building a relationship with, but they're not saved. They're not required to tithe. They're not thinking about it. So therefore, they're going to be tipping God. They're going to be throwing $5 and $10 in the bucket. This is just the financial reality of it. And the expectation is that even once they get saved, when they get saved, it's like once you get to the grasp the idea of yes, they should tithe. Most people's finances are so all over the place. It's going to take a while. It's going to take a level of spiritual maturity. The second, a level of financial maturity before they get to the point of tithing. I've experienced it as a pastor and as a planter that you help lead people to faith, but their finances will take a while to catch up of where their heart is towards the Lord till they get to that point of tithing. So that's why if you go out and you start out with 30 people and you reach 20 people in that first year, well, you're going to probably have 20 people who are saved and who you baptize or who are open to the Lord, but that doesn't mean their pocketbooks are open yet. And that's not what you're after, but I'm just saying that's the reality that you have to deal with when you are putting together a plan and a projection. You have to recognize that's going to be a reality. Don't expect them to walk in and the day one start tithing, because they're going to be, I know my wife and I, our family, when we got saved and we started doing ministry, we were, every dollar was spoken for, and it wasn't going to the church. But it took a while for that transition to take place. And so that's why you'll see those numbers coming down from 19, 18, 17. It actually decreased. There are different ways you can do that. Some guys will say, hey, look, I'm starting up high, but then the first couple of years is going to go down. But then as I help teach them, as they grow, then it'll get back to the point where it'll start to come back. But think through in your community, what is a good number? The socioeconomics of what's happening. Are you in a poor community? If you're in a community of a bunch of single family households, you have to think through what that actually looks like. Because if you have a lot of single moms bringing 5 kids to church, that's going to obviously change your averages from when you guys start, because you're going to count them in attendance, but by that same token, they're not going to be given nearly as much. So that's going to change your numbers. And this is the screen where, this is where, if you think about it, you take the number of people you have coming on that screen prior, multiply it by this screen here with who's given per week and how much, will give you a sense of what your tithe and offering budget is going to be for the year. So that's why I said these two screens are very, very important. So you can move on to the next slide. Then obviously this is your sending church. And so your sending church is going to be the main church. We always say that a lot of times planters as well as partners will say, well, how much does a sending church give? And I would say typically, if you could look at it, roughly about $2,000 a month is the typical average. Some give more, some give less. Do not try to push away a sending church if they're giving you $1,000 a month, and you want to. And that's the best you have. That's the best you have. That's what God's given you. Just for example purposes, doesn't mean they're going to support you all 5 years, but that's just a sense of what the sending church would give. And then obviously you have to include the name of the sending church, contact and pastor, and their email address, because when you're done this, it does go out to them to verify. A lot of partners want to be able to see, yes, this is what I've committed to, and so you want to have a conversation with them ahead of time to let them know, hey, I know you didn't promise me 5 years, but I had to put a projection in, and it may even help you to be able to say, hey, this is kind of what I'm thinking. So it allows you to be able in some way start or either confirm a financial conversation that you've had with that sending church. That's next screen, please. Supporting church. So therefore you have the supporting churches here. Those are the ones that are going to be given to you. Once again, a sending church, and these are the definitions that NAM uses a lot of times. A sending church is a church that is committed not only to you, but committed also to the community that you're planting in. So let's say, for example, we pick Roxborough as an area. If you up and left tomorrow, that sending church would still be committed to Roxborough to try to help find another planter for that community. Now that's hard to find in a lot of situations, because most of the times the sending church is always tied to the planter. Like wherever you go, they go. But the ideal situation is a sending church is one who really is focused on that community where you guys are, and where you said you want to plant. A supporting church is going to be more of what you would typically see as a church that's supporting you. They're a church that if you left Roxborough tomorrow and went to Uganda, they're following you to Uganda. And some, even the sending church might do both. They may say, hey, we'll still follow you to Uganda, but we still want to help find somebody to do ministry work and do a plant a church in Roxborough. But that's kind of the differences other than financial for us from sending to supporting church. That's kind of the thought process, is that supporting church is going to pretty much follow you where you go. And they're going to be committed to you for a period of time. Feel free to have multiple supporting churches. A typical church plant will have probably one sending church and 2 supporting churches. Next screen, please. NAM through convention. I'll get to this screen later. It is things you need to realize is the North American Mission Board will partner generally for a year at a time, just because so many different things change. But if you can feel free to put in 5 years worth of projections, and now you'll sit down and work this out with your CPC. Everybody here know who their church planning catalyst is, their CPC is. Everybody know? So whoever you're working with, that's who you'll sit down and kind of work through what that projection is. But even if you sit down with NAM and say, hey, these are 5 years what we're looking at, always know that NAM is only promising or committing to do 1 year at a time. And sometimes maybe even shorter than that, depending on the situation or circumstance. But the thought process is it's generally a year commitment, and please don't look and say, well, you told us, 2 years ago that you're going to give us $1,000 in year 3. That's not guaranteed. It can be lower, it could be 0, it could be more than the amount that's shown. It's going to depend on the ministry as you guys go through it. Because you have to realize, in a lot of ways, we might put a number in there, but it's going to be based on, if you're saying, I'm starting at 30 people, that at the end of year 3, I plan to be at 70 people. Well, a lot of times the number that NAM or your sending or supported churches is committed to giving is based on 70 people. If at the end of year 3, you've gone from 30 to 10, well, you can't really expect those same partners to be as committed. Now, it depends on what the reasons are as to why those numbers have changed, but the expectation is that it's going to be roughly a year at a time. On this screen, where you'll have to put in the numbers, the screen pops up that says NAM through convention. You fill in those numbers. Once you fill in those numbers, NAM through convention, another screen will pop up and say you must enter contact information. And when you put in the contact information, you have to put in, that's where my name goes in, or whoever the state director of missions is at the time, and you're going to put in, obviously my email address, cjenkins@nam.net, because what happens is after you work with your CPC, it then comes to me for review before it goes on to Alpharetta. So that's the NAM through convention screen. Individuals. Individuals that you have, I guess that's on the screen.
Yes.
So as individuals, a lot of times, some of you have a good network of probably 10 or 20 different individuals that you guys have that are given to your ministry and are given to you guys to support you. From this perspective, what I always recommend is that if you have a large network of people that are given $10 a month or $50 a month, lump them all together into 1 or 2 different individuals and just put your name underneath there as the confirmation number, because we're not trying to go out and contact 20 people to say, hey, you know, are you giving $10 a month to Eric? We're not trying to ask all of that. What we're trying to do is, once again, this is for you. It's a way for you guys to count all those individual donations, but by the same token, you don't have to go back and confirm all those. You can feel free to lump those into one line item where you add up the amount. Say all of my individual givers are giving roughly $1,700 a month. Put in that $1,700 a month for the projected year. Put your name in, or you can type in individual givers as the actual name, and then put your email address, and that's good. If you have somebody who's giving a significant amount of money, if they're giving $500 or $1,000 a month, almost like a sending or supporting church would, or $250 a month, I probably would include them on there. It's just a way for you to kind of remember they don't get lumped in with everybody else. Sometimes you may want to give them more information down the road. You may want to reach out to them specially, but that's what I would recommend from an individual standpoint. Next screen, please. Personnel expenses. This is obviously what you feel you need to support your family, what you feel like you would take as a salary for the church as pastor. It's also going to include anybody else. If you need a minister of music, whatever else you need, it's going to have to sit there in that projected year for income. So, once again, based on context, based on economics of your community, the people that you're reaching, the city that you're in, the neighborhood, that'll all drive that particular number. Have the conversation with the core team sooner rather than later. You don't want them to get sticker shock. If you have $80,000 in there, and at some point in time you have to go to them for that salary, and they're thinking more $30,000 a year. Because a lot of times this can be, I guess it will be hidden from your core team, because there's no other mechanism by which, other than you giving it to them, that they'll know exactly how much total money is being raised. Because most of your partners are coming from outside. They'll know what's coming in tithe and offering, but the other outside monies don't necessarily come. They'll come through a sending church or supporting church. So it's important to be able, I always say, is to have that conversation sooner than later. So that whatever number, you won't be too far off in the number they're thinking about you is going to be good for you versus the number that you need. If you need $80,000, deal with that up front. I've had church planters who have put in $50,000 a year in marketing and advertising and building and all the other things, and I looked at the funding projector and I said, I started asking questions. I said, well, how are you going to eat? And they're like, what are you talking about? I said, well, where's the money for you as a salary? And unfortunately, his wife was sitting there at the time as well. And he was like, oh, I forgot about that.
Well,
So the thought process is you have to think about that. Have the conversation and the thought process. It's difficult to start having that financial conversation, especially when you're doing something for the Lord. But have the conversation so that you can start dealing with what's going to be a reasonable number. So at least they know that's what you're shooting for. And once again, you can go and use those other screens we talked about as far as the attendance and the giving to be able to have a reasonable conversation with them. The other thing too is if you look at the math and just based on the context that you're in, the church, you can look at it and based on the giving of people, if you had 100 people and even at 100 people, the most your church is going to be able to pretty much give is probably going to be about $30,000 a year. Then you're probably, if you're here in Philadelphia, you're probably going to need to be bivocational. So the expectation is start there now. Don't try to expect to be full-time now and then slide back into bivocationalism. The thought is just, if you're going to be bivocational, ultimately, let's just put a plan in that now. I mean, I've found out in most cases that being bivocational is really getting you to be able to be paid to be out in the community amongst unbelievers. The story I always tell is the story of a planter in Pittsburgh who was set up pretty much to be able to be full-time, but he intentionally wanted to work out in the community. So he went and got a job at a bank. And he was working, probably 20, 25 hours at the bank each week. But in his community, in his context and in his community, he said, hey, Cliff, this bank is paying me to have people that I want to connect with anyway line up to have a conversation with me and to have transactions with me. And it paid major dividends because they got to see him and know him. He got a chance to minister. Sometimes have to think from a godly perspective, think out of the box. God's not bound by how much money NAM gives or doesn't give. He can do it in a lot of different ways. You just have to be open to what he wants to do. At the bottom is admin expenses. This could go one of two ways. A lot of people put in their rent for a building in there. Some don't. They'll put in ministry expenses, which is on the next page. You can do it either way. A lot of times admin expenses could be, we need to buy software to be able to do our books. That's going to be maybe a one-time deal. We may have some other admin expenses that we need to do, bank accounts or some other things that we'll put in admin. We might have, most people think of an administrative assistant, but very few church plants are going to have an admin administrative assistant. That's usually what you have delegated to somebody else in the church that's an unpaid position. But that's going to be your administrative expenses. So those will be your two key pieces. If you expect, hey, in year 5 we want to bring on somebody else, that's good to put in there. But once again, we'll get to the other screen. You have to be able to balance the budgets out. I always try to tell planters, it's okay, because when you put these in, you can save it, copy it, and create as many as you want to try to play around with, well, what if this and what if that? What if we had 300 people? What if we had 50? You can change all the numbers around and get a sense of what it looks like. Once again, this is for you guys. But what it does is it allows you to really kind of get a sense to figure out what are the likely possibilities from this budget projection. Next slide, please. Other missions. Other missions is exactly what it says. It could be missions in other countries, other cities. It could be other church plants. My caution to you is that this is my personal opinion as somebody who's a supporter, and the thought is that you probably don't want that number too high to start, because a lot of planters say, hey, yeah, we want to be in there for the team, and we want to be supporting other planters and doing things like that. But if that number is as high as the number, if I'm a sending church or supporting church and I'm giving you $1,000 a month, but you're giving $1,000 a month out to something else, it's almost like a pass-through for me. It's like, well, if I wanted to give to Uganda, I could give to Uganda on my own. I don't have to pass it through you guys. And so you have to, I would think of, as they always say when getting on the airplane, you put your oxygen mask on first to make sure you're being taken care of, and then you go to help someone else. So I would recommend and kind of encourage you, if you're going to start getting significant numbers in the other missions piece, that's going to go in probably years 4 and 5, when you're getting close to autonomy. And in reality, probably more like year 7, between years 7 and 10. Because guess what? Even though NAM puts together and does this budget projector in a 5-year projection, okay, even though it goes in a 5-year projection, that doesn't mean God's going to answer and get you to fully autonomous in 5 years. In Pennsylvania and South Jersey, we usually say plan for 7 to 10. And if you plan for 7 to 10, if God shows up in 3 years and does it, amen. But plan for 7 to 10. Because that way your wife, your kids know we're in it for the long haul. We're not going to start complaining, and the core team members aren't going to start complaining if after 3 years we're just now launching and we're still at 25 people. So just don't be bound by 5 years. The ministry expenses pieces, that's where I usually do outreach, building rental, just things that you're doing out in the community, be able to reach people, gather them, connect with them. That's usually where your ministry expenses go. In the state convention, we usually ask for the state convention to put together a strategic plan each year. What are you going to do? If you're going to have Easter egg hunt, how much is that roughly going to cost? We know that you're not always going to be able to hit it, but what is that going to be? What other pieces are going to be charged there that you're going to have to put into your projection? If something comes up in the middle of the year, guess what? That's what we have evangelism grants for. I'll talk about that later. But you generally want to think through for 2020 coming up, what are we going to do as outreach in the community? And that's what you put as your estimated ministry expenses. And feel free, if you want to put rent in there, put it in there. It's $1,000 a month to $1,000 per month to rent a building. $12,000 a year can go into your ministry as part of your ministry expenses. Next screen. Getting to these last couple slides here. This is the balanced budget. Gus that can see the screen, take a look at that. What is the problem that you see or problems with that particular budget? Because that's the reality of what was in all those other screens. What do you see as a problem?
You're upside down by year 3.
Yep, upside down by year 3, you're bringing in 75 and expenses of 102. Forget that actual income column, that doesn't pay, that's not for this example. Anything else?
You're losing money.
Yeah, you look at it. Yeah, exactly, especially in year 5. Now, the one thing that I'll say in all honesty is that we didn't put in money from NAM other than in year 1. But a lot of times, what this does is, if you have a CPC that asks you, well, just put in 1 year for us, or leave the NAM through convention 0, leave the NAM dollar 0. A lot of times, your CPC is doing that so that they can see what the true need is, and they can help decide where is best to come alongside, and then put the help and give the some financial support. Next screen. I think I just blew it up a little bit bigger. Yeah. Just so you can see it a little bit bigger as to what the thought process is. So the goal is always to have a nice balanced income. You have to think through, what are my legitimate expenses, what do I need, and then be able to balance it out with what the income's going to be. And I think that's the last thing. That's the last slide I had, I believe.